Good evening, Christine, in Melbourne. Good afternoon to all of you in Europe and Middle East, and good morning to all of you in the rest of the world, wherever you are. Thank you for coming and watching, participating in another series or another event in the series on theories of regulation. And today we have with us one of the leading researchers on regulation, Professor Christine Parker. She will talk about from responsive regulation to ecological compliance. This is the topic. She starts with perhaps with John Braithwaite, and then to a new approach, Christine, ecological compliance. I will let you define it yourself, but we'll say a few words about your background. You are a professor at the Melbourne Law School and also Chief Investigator in the ARC Center for Excellence of Automated Decision-Making and Society in Melbourne. She's doing socio-legal research on enforcement, on compliance, and she made important empirical, conceptual, and policy contribution to the politics, ethics, and democratic governance of regulation. This was done in a range of areas, including competition and consumer protection law, the food system, the legal profession, environmental health and safety regulation, and she's currently working on the ecological impact of big tech. This is the center that I mentioned on automated decision-making in society. She did several books, but I'd like to mention just one just for convenience and also important. Her Open Cooperation, Business Self-Regulation and Democracy is a masterpiece for as much as I can say. So thank you very much, Christine, for giving us this presentation, and I welcome your participation, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, David, and I will share my screen. Okay, so let me first take the opportunity to thank you for inviting me to contribute to this marvelous series that you're running. And that's a totally gratuitous picture of a mother koala with a baby koala, just to let you know I'm coming to you from Australia. And it's our custom in Australia to always start our remarks by acknowledging the country on which we live and work. So I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, Naarm, and the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I acknowledge that First Nations care of this country endured for tens of thousands of years and indeed continues to this day. And I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past, present and emerging. And I extend those respects to any other First Nations people who might be present today or listening to this later on. So my talk today is an overview of regulatory studies through the lens of my interest in corporate compliance with legal, social and environmental responsibilities. And I'm going to argue that the chief achievement of regulatory scholarship to date has been to expand our understanding of compliance from a technocratic, instrumental, rule-by-rule calculation to a socially and politically embedded network of responsibilities, exemplified by Ayres and Braithwaite's idea of responsive regulation and my own idea of meta-regulation of the open corporation. However, I also want to start by acknowledging that all human activity, including commercial activity and the way it's governed and embedded in interconnected social and environmental ecologies, and that this is a matter which urgently demands deep acknowledgement and engagement by regulatory studies as a matter of both empirical analysis and normative evaluation and design. So I'm going to suggest that a further movement in regulatory studies towards ecological regulation and indeed ecological compliance is urgent and necessary. So I'm just going to start by setting the scene on that. So we know that climate disruption is already causing a code red for humanity, but it's not just climate disruption with which we earthlings are now contending. It's a multiple interconnected cascade of ecological and social crises. So the planetary boundaries, some of you may be familiar with that idea. It's just one easy to grasp conceptualization of how human activity is dangerously disrupting the way Earth's ecologies operate. And it points out that the dire threats to the social, political and economic conditions of human life include climate disruption, also biodiversity loss, the disruption of the global nitrogen and phosphorus cycles through pesticide use, among other things, and the accumulation of plastics and other novel human-made materials in the ocean and everywhere else. And we shouldn't forget that these human-induced ecological disruption also has a horrific impact on non-human species, many of whom are, oops, that's not the right photo, many of whom are capable of suffering also as they lose their homes and families. The reason I mention the planetary boundaries concept is because it emphasises the interconnection between these ecological processes. It points out that changes in one boundary will likely trigger further global environmental change in the others to create destabilising feedbacks with human activity, as we know, such as burning coal and oil, destroying forests and producing lots of monocrops and meat, having reverberating catastrophic effects. So in addition to seeing issues like climate change or fertiliser abuse or whatever it is as discrete problems that can each be solved by staying within specific limits on each issue, we must also see them as intrinsically interconnected and needing to be addressed together. And as I'll explain it a little bit later, I think this is the big challenge for how we think about regulatory studies. And of course, it's not just these environmental crises that interconnect. Ecological crises will also further entrench pre-existing social and economic inequalities that human rights and social and economic regulation regimes are already struggling to address. And so this is another influential conceptualisation of the intersecting ecological and social equality challenges for global governance. It's Kate Raworth's donut economics. She powerfully argues for the need to integrate the economics of sustainable development inside the limits of planetary boundaries to ensure a safe and just operating space for humanity. And whether you agree with her particular model or not, again, what's important here is she persuasively points out that however you look at it, we cannot, in fact or in conscience, engage with the need for governance of environmental crises without at the same time engaging social and economic inequality and vice versa. And so this is what Fiona Haynes and I mean when we talk about ecological regulation as an analytic and a normative concept. But of course, we know regulatory prescriptions like this one that Raworth has put forth are much easier to aspire to than they are to achieve. And this is because the production of ecological crisis and social inequality emanate from an economic and governance system that shows a fundamental lack of respect for the web of social and environmental ecological relations, which actually give us life and meaning. And so this is where we come to regulatory studies. One of the important drivers for that is financial, profit-oriented business activity. And so I argue that this is a question of how whole markets operate to create and perpetuate a self-reinforcing, financialized, productivist, consumptogenic system. So that's one that encourages the production and consumption of commodities, in greater amounts, more quickly and more often, and sort of culturally puts that forth as the primary pathway to economic, global and individual flourishing, with scant regard for the impact on social and ecological relations. And I should mention that the big tech takeover of not only the market, but also of government and the civic and social spheres, and even our most intimate relationships with family, friends, and increasingly our own minds, is a further complication in this story. So a number of commentators have pointed out big tech is creating a new frontier of commercial extraction, certainly of our data, of our attention, arguably, and also of the energy and minerals to drive the new technologies, and through hyper-personalised advertising and the monopolisation of our mental and social ecologies, it is also worsening the consumptogenic crisis that I talked about a moment ago. So it's entrenching the sense that the only thing to aspire to is greater consumption and greater production. At least that's my fear or my hypothesis. Even as we're seeing these tech companies promise, somewhat outlandishly, I think, that they'll solve all our problems. Okay, so that's the big picture account of the problems that business regulation either purports or perhaps ought to purport to be able to solve. So now I want to think about how regulatory studies deals with these challenges. And my focus will be on analytic understandings of regulation and compliance that also propose normative solutions to the harms caused or potentially caused by commercial activity. And every good talk needs a foil to start with. So I'll start with instrumental regulation. So the dominant liberal conception of regulation, and I think it still is the dominant conception in practice, sees business impact on the social and natural worlds as a series of individual externalities, suggesting the need for rules to fix market failures one issue at a time through instrumental regulation, designed to intrude as discreetly and narrowly as possible into commercial activity. So at best, this regulation does seek to internalise responsibility for social and environmental externalities within the market through requiring compliance with rules, innovation and adoption of new technologies, environmental restoration and remediation, compensation, and so on. Although rarely is outright prohibition of harmful conduct contemplated. And in this conception, government regulation is itself seen as requiring strict control. So cost-benefit analyses see regulation as negative and frame the problem as enabling competition and economic growth rather than putting limits on extractive activity. Light touch regulation is preferred. And even where strong regulation is in place, government often make exemptions to fast track particular, often environmentally and socially destructive projects. So this privileges the need for competitive markets and economic growth in the present over the serious consequences for future generations of failing to address eco-social challenges. It puts the relationship between commercial production and consumption as primary, and the social and ecological webs that produce life and everything else as secondary, on the assumption that economic growth will, somehow eventually solve all our social and environmental problems. Now, of course, instrumental regulation has made many, many important improvements to business activity. Trains, planes, coal mines, they're all a lot safer than they might have been. But the problems of instrumental compliance are also manifold. Creative compliance or gaming of the system to avoid substantive change, ritualism, meaningless compliance. and I'm sure we're all familiar with the problems. A further limitation is a tendency towards privileging larger economic operators who can afford to influence and comply with regulatory obligations over smaller operators who struggle to keep up, meaning that a monoculture of big players become more and more powerful, while the diversity of enterprises and economies that are flourishing ecology of business are missing. In the instrumental mode, as I've said, business regulation is seen as a cost to the economy, presumed to be an impediment to the business of doing business, in Milton Friedman's words. So this forces those of us who wish to advocate for regulation and business compliance into a corner in which we must either argue that regulation is important enough in each particular case to justify harsh sanctions to force out the bad apple actor, so the one who engages in fraud in Milton Friedman's quote, or we have to concede that actually the problem is not so bad and businesses can be trusted to self-regulate with guidance and support from regulatory agencies. So we're kind of forced into this dilemma. And I think this is where Ayres and Braithwaite's responsive regulation cut into the debate, arguing that this was a false dilemma between strict regulation and self-regulation. And I've put the quote up there where they said near the beginning of their book, there's a long history of barren disputation between those who think that companies will voluntarily comply only when confronted with tough sanctions, and those who believe that gentle persuasion works. So their theory of responsive regulation proposed a normative solution to transcend the standoff between regulation and deregulation, the famous pyramid, in which government should be responsive to the conduct of those they seek to regulate in deciding whether a more or less interventionist or punitive response is needed. Ayres and Braithwaite emphasised that individuals and firms can have multiple motivations for compliance, material motivations based on self-interest that might be activated by deterrence, normative motivations to comply with rules that are seen as procedurally or substantively just, and social motivations to be respected and approved by others. And they and others also argued that there were sort of different logics of action that could be institutionalized in different contexts to activate these different motivations. Now, I see this Ayres and Braithwaite's approach as one of a whole family of policy-oriented, responsively rational approaches to regulatory studies, which have challenged and developed the instrumental regulation approach. Responsive regulation approaches see regulation as a plural regulatory space in which many different actors, market, state and civil society sectors engage in regulation of one another. It recognises that regulatory compliance is not an objective, stable response to official regulatory commands, but a socially embedded process that can be negotiated and shaped over time from multiple angles. Neil Gunningham's normative policy ideal of smart regulation, for example, suggests that business and civil society actors can construct second and third faces to the regulatory pyramid apart from government action and sort of cover over the weakness of government action. In his earlier work with Kagan, Gunningham referred to businesses thus being regulated by a social and an economic license or licenses alongside the legal license, and that these legal, social and economic licenses could be activated by the actions of plural actors, including supply chain partners, banks, insurers, public interest groups, and so on. but of course, but they also pointed out these may or may not be in alignment with each other. So there could be conflict and politics, and some have focused on that side of things. In recent times, Gunningham has applied this approach in arguing for the power of social movement campaigns to campaign for institutional investors to divest from fossil fuels and morally shame the fossil fuel companies where government has failed to act. And Fiona Haynes and I have argued that this is, at best, or at its most powerful, this is an attempt from civil society to act at the tip of a pyramid to claim back the criminal law and name continued fossil fuel company denial and obfuscation of climate change as a criminal act of ecocide. So sort of claiming back the law that hadn't been used. Oh, I thought I'd put a pretty picture of people being happy about they look about the reef. So responsive regulation is also about responsive compliance, I argue, and I argue this is where the work that I did on the open corporation fits in. So this responsive regulation and responsive compliance approach sees businesses capable of doing more than business, of being responsible citizens, so capable of doing it, but only through their embeddedness in networks of social, political and economic actors who could and would encourage and indeed force compliance and beyond compliance, virtue and responsibility. So my idea of the meta-regulation of the open corporation sought to establish an ideal type of what responsive compliance might look like from the inside out for large business corporations. So this diagram is based on that book, and which was based on my own I guess, meta-analysis of the literature and my own field work in a sample of about 30 large multinational companies in different industries with reputations for best practice compliance management in sexual harassment, financial services, and environment and health and safety. And I concluded that companies needed to go through 3 phases in order to implement a compliance system that had some hope of working, and that, or to self-regulate, in other words, and that legal or regulatory pressure and civic or social movement pressure and market or supply chain pressure would generally be needed to push them through each phase. So the 3 phases were first, top management commitment to be serious about self-regulation or social responsibility in relation to a particular issue. And I argued that this typically only occurred where there was a crisis or scandal affecting the business or one of its close competitors that forced senior management to take notice, or at least in the first instance. The second step would be the engagement of professionals or experts from either inside or outside the company to design policies and procedures that included engagement with internal and external stakeholders. And I argued that this typically only occurred appropriately where someone with a professional commitment to values external to the business, or who sort of had it, personally wanted to champion those values, was appointed to the task and were given sufficient resources and seniority. And there's quite a lot in the book about how this is a very uncomfortable position for these professionals and how they manage that, how their values would be tested or watered down, and how they sometimes manage that. And then the third step was the integration of the policy into operating procedures, technologies, and performance appraisals, and so on and so forth, including a system for checking that everything was working. And I had quite a lot to say about how that worked or didn't work a fair bit of the time in practice, which I won't go into here. And I also had something to say about how these things become institutionalized and, you know, at some point become standard practice, you know, if we think of food safety programs these days. But the big point was that none of this is possible if we simply rely on business or industry sector on its own. There's no such thing as pure self-regulation in isolation, but it is possible, at least in theory, where there's meta-regulation, regulation of self-regulation by state regulators, and I actually argued for the need for multiple regulators on different topics and so on, to ensure accountability, responsibility and reflexive action in the open corporation, and also engagement by non-state actors, specifically civil society organisations such as professional organisations and social movements, to keep the pressure up. Now, this was put forward as an ideal type to aspire to in theoretically possible conditions, rather than the description of a widespread empirical reality. And after I'd done that book, I then went on to a big study with Vibeke Nielsen from University of Aarhus, where we did a huge survey of large businesses in Australia as to their compliance practices and data about their regulatory outcomes and so on in relation to competition and consumer protection law. I also did a whole heap of in-depth interviews with the regulators, and then later on with some of the businesses who'd been pinged. But through our quantitative survey, we developed and validated a theoretical model, which is indicated there on the slide, to adequately describe the range of experiences and compliance relevant factors for the large businesses in our sample. But not surprisingly, our data didn't pinpoint any one magic formula that explained compliance and non-compliance. And this really points to the disadvantages of the responsible regulation approach. In the real world, responsive regulation isn't translated into practice as intended by its proponents, with the right combination of sticks, carrots, and corporate capital punishment or de-licensing as sitting there to sort of force or encourage self-regulation. Instead, these approaches in real life are shaped by economic and political interests and often end up looking a lot like a soft, weak version of instrumental regulation, big on procedure and optics and short on substance and sanctions. And in the subsequent literature and practice, meta-regulation, for example, is often discussed in a way that's narrowed back down to a dyadic relationship between a single regulator and regulatee on a single issue, with no democratic accountability, no vision of the overall embeddedness of business activity in social democracy or civic society. So it becomes merely sort of meta-governance of risk management. And much as we might hope for the idealistic version of responsive regulation and responsive compliance, the reality in the Western world, at least, is that generally only markets are seen as legitimate constraints on business. Government action to constrain businesses is often defined as authoritarian and to be used only rarely, although as COVID times have demonstrated, the situation with respect to individuals is rather different. And we've also seen the hollowing out of institutions of civil society and funding of diverse alternative economies that were necessary to help create social change and hold both business and government accountable. I hope you like that slide, David. As Levy4 and others have observed, law and regulation made, nurtured and constrained the capitalist system. So through the creation and enforcement of concepts such as private property, companies, stock markets, competition law, insurance, and so on, commercial activity has been enabled and markets created and nurtured. But there are also counter movements seeking to mobilise law and regulation to tame capitalism, that is, to limit the capacity of commercial activity to extract further economic value from human workers and consumers and from our relations with each other and from the environment. And then there's the counter movements. So, you know, we see regulation as a constant contest, as Fiona Haynes, my colleague, would say, a field of struggle over the politics of the market and the very boundaries of what commercial activity is allowable and what is out of bounds. And so, you know, we have instrumental regulation, then we can have responsive regulation that sort of tries to push further, but then it is going to get interpreted and reinterpreted and tamed back again by this dynamic of contest. So Fiona Haynes and I argue that in analysing this field of struggle, regulatory studies scholarship has not yet paid enough attention to the whole network of social and environmental ecologies in which we're embedded. So for the final little bit of the talk, we therefore call for ecological regulation as a deepening of the social embeddedness recognised by responsive regulation. And this challenges current conceptions of legal regulation by requiring a much greater prominence to ensuring the protection and enhancement and regeneration of social and environmental ecological systems and non-capitalist economic activity. And if ecological regulation is necessary, then so too is ecological compliance, that is the capacity for business entities to open out their own governance, not just to social and legal responsibilities, but also to ecological responsibilities. Now, obviously, this is quite a challenging idea, so I'm just going to take a few more minutes to make 3 suggestions about what this might mean for analytic and normative studies of regulation and compliance in practice, and based on the work I've been doing lately and hoping to do in the near future. So firstly, we argue an ecological approach abhors monocultures of all kinds, but our global economic our global political economy and the way it's regulated tend to concentrate power in a monoculture of large corporates, and the current privileging of market-based governance as the solution to all regulatory problems sustains this system. So, you know, this is private industry standards and most abhorrently, the tendency to constantly responsibilize individual consumers, workers, and members of the precariat as being the ones who, you know, need to take responsibility for their own condition. Whether this is something as seemingly innocuous as telling us that it's up to us to save the Amazon or save the animals by choosing a food with the right provenance and certification, or whether it's the tragedy that so far the best solution we've been able to come up with to to keep fossil fuels in the ground in many countries, including my own country, is a corporate disclosure regime predicated on shareholder analysis of scenarios, climate scenarios that should never ever be allowed to actually happen. But I think as regulatory and compliance scholars, we need to notice the way that the deployment of the regulatory toolkit over many separate issues and domains tends to privilege a particular market-based approach that perpetuates corporate power and monopoly and legitimates rather than reins in that power. That is, it fails to ever sort of go up to the top of that pyramid and put any limits on extraction and exploitation overall across everything. The second point is that it's kind of the flip side of the first, that an ecological approach values diversity across whole ecosystems, diversity of regulatory solutions, diversity of economic, social, and environmental activity. And as critical and feminist economists have pointed out, our current systems of regulation and governance devalue alternative economies, the core economy, the households in which the vulnerable are cared for and children are nurtured, the gift economy, the volunteer and activist work, Indigenous knowledge systems and social entrepreneurialism are also devalued. And the sharing economy was, of course, absolutely hijacked by the new big tech wave of extractivism. And in my work on food systems governance, and particularly food labelling as governance, I've tried to take on the challenge of these first two points by deconstructing the politics of market-based governance of the food system, particularly the way food labelling is used, inspired by the work of Dorothy Smith and also Susan Silby. I tried to start from the standpoint of a consumer of food, which is all of us, and ask what's the ecology of public and private governance arrangements that give us whatever range of choice we have, that is the market. What does this market value and devalue? And what does it imply about what sort of regulation of business activity is even possible these days? And we went on to show the way that how different rules and regulatory objectives across different domains are acted to create and legitimate unsustainable production and consumption across a whole market. And particularly how smaller scale agroecological producers who try to come up with alternatives have their methods appropriated and greenwashed by industrially produced food. Anyway, I could talk for a while about that, but I'll go on to my third and final point about ecological regulation and compliance, which follows on nicely. And this is to challenge ourselves to expand our conception of the network of actors in regulatory space to include more than human actors, particularly other living species and indeed ecosystems. So although responsive regulation theory demonstrates that plural voices can have an impact, and there has been some attention to how architecture or design of physical and online spaces can be regulation or part of a regulatory network, I think in regulatory studies we've largely neglected the more than human world as salient regulatory actors. And this is partly because in Western culture, we're only just beginning to develop ways to pay attention to ecology and the more than human world through both professional science and attentiveness to other forms of knowing, including Indigenous knowledge traditions. So what difference would it make to our accounts if we included as part of the regulatory space the non-human animals in the farm who resist certain treatments or who are vulnerable to zoonotic disease or food poisoning or to humans or whatever, or who evoke feelings of sympathy in the public at large? What about the soil that becomes ungrowable, salinated, or the ocean or bay that becomes unfishable and unswimmable due to the runoff or due to the mess produced by aquaculture? All of these, in a sense, regulate commercial activity and certainly activate civil society regulators and alternative entrepreneurs with different ideas of how to do things. So they're part of that network of regulatory space. And when we talk about the motivations or drivers for compliance, I mentioned before, we often talk about self-interested material motivations, we talk about social motivations, we talk about normative motivations, but I think we need to add a separate fourth set of motivations, ecological motivations that relate to our innate sense that we're embodied beings in socio-ecological systems. So, you know, we're seeing more and more recognition of the fact that we have a drive to be connected to nature and that we feel anxious when we see natural places ruined. So I think that's my most concrete suggestion, that we should add that to our list of motivations as a separate thing. But So I'm hoping to explore some of these ideas further in our work on big tech and ecological regulation, which I think is a very nice test case of contested claims, because of the contested claims over how technology might either reconnect us to ecology through smart solutions or further disembed us not only from social relations but also connections with nature. And where we have a postdoc, Lou Seller, who's actually starting some work on energy use and environmental credentials of data centres and how they're governed very soon. So in conclusion, I've given my take on the unfolding of regulatory studies over time, what I see as the big challenge for regulatory and compliance studies, and how some of my own work fits into that in its own way. And I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Christine. Fascinating presentation. I see that you are trying to, yes, you're now fully with us all over the screen. And I welcome questions and comments. I see Michael raising his hand, or do you want to start, Michael? Or maybe others? Anyone else just come into the discussion? Because I don't necessarily see you all. And if not, I will be the first to start. So this is fascinating. I loved all the presentation, but my slide, and it's not only because the short, but I'm trying to connect your criticism of instrumental approaches to regulation or regulatory reform to the larger argument about on the need to rethink ecological issues and to integrate them into regulatory theories. And I'm very sympathetic for that, but I don't see a different instrumental approach, and we need the instrument, right? It's not that we are moving from instrumental regulation to a different system of regulation, more like changing our normative basis from market-based regulation to something else, which include ecological issues, maybe a major item on the agenda, but social and economic issues are still there. And then developing a new set of instrument grounded in political understanding of what should be done. And what I'm missing is the kind of the agenda for regulatory reform beyond the compliance, beyond responsive regulation, beyond more economic narrow cost benefit analysis and so on. And can you relate to that? Are we speaking in the same language, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, and I may have made the presentation too short in some ways, but certainly we're not arguing that we're moving from instrumental to responsive to ecological in the sense of throwing each one out. We see them as building blocks. So we're certainly not saying don't do the instrumental. We're saying all are necessary. But I think that the thing that so you ask about, well, what is the normative agenda then? So what and sorry, when I say we, I'm talking about me and Fiona Haynes, because we've talked about this a lot, obviously. We're arguing that in terms of, if we're thinking about the ecological regulation part of the equation, it would be illogical to sort of say there should just be one thing or one design, because we're talking about the need for diversity in an ecosystem. So we certainly don't want to fall back into that same trap. And the concern with the thing that needs to be added to instrumental regulation is that often, you know, we each do our studies of a separate rule addressed to a separate problem. We need to do that. We're not saying don't do that. But what we're saying is that these rules all add up, and we sort of end up with the same inflection on all of them because of the political and economic system and the cultural values that we're in. And we, in addition to doing our one-by-one studies, we also need to talk about, well, what are the overall sort of system values, if you want to talk about it that way, that are tending to inflect our work, the biases that are coming in, that we're not seeing, that actually there should be a whole range of ways of doing instrumental regulation. We should be responsive. And I won't speak for Fiona here because this is more my idea, but my sense of it is that there are a set of governance agendas that are foundational to being able to do instrumental regulation well in whatever domain you're talking about. And that as regulatory and compliance scholars, we should be thinking about what those are, and that is a normative goal. And I'm talking about things like not allowing big companies to lobby politicians, having a decent tax system, having a decent social security system. So, because, you know, if we don't have a precariat and if people can have the basics that they need, then a lot of other things kind of fall into place. They can do their activism, they can look after children, they can do civil society stuff, fun, you know, so there's sort of severe regulation on advertising and the old style European approach to competition law, where we're actually trying to encourage a diversity of business, not just allowing sort of the biggest one to win. So, you know, there's probably 7 or 8 things that are crucial to both environmental justice and social and economic justice, and that are foundational to doing any other form of regulation right. And that often when we write our studies, we forget to ask that question about what's the bigger conditions behind all this. And that means we also forget that all the little bits add up to still legitimating a system that's actually creating these huge problems.
I think you are going in excellent, just doing admirable work and approach. What I will be looking after this talk is to define this instrument of regulation for a world of climate change, more complex and so on, for the regulatory reform of the next century or the next decade or the next year. But this is the direction. And because you are bringing the normative in a way that is clearly important. And here you really on equal foot with John Braithwaite, but actually you are taking it farther, asking for new sets of instruments, or this is my reading at least. So thank you very much. I will stop here for now. There is Dieter want to ask a question, but there is also before a question from Sevi, and he wrote it. You may want to read it. I will read it for the video. I love your presentation, Professor Parquet, about the multiplicity of regulatory space, in particular the ecological one. And then he says something like, I missed there, where are you? I have a question about corporate reporting. Now we have witnessed multiple reporting initiatives which aim at different groups of audience. What do you think of capable representing? I have a small screen, maybe you can read it before me.
Oh, right, yeah. Actually, I think you missed. So Sevi asked, shouldn't ecological regulation be on motivation? I think she means be part of instrumental, normative and social. So that was one question, because I argued that there should be a fourth sort of set of ecological. And then the next question that you were trying to read out there about corporate reporting asks basically, who would be capable of representing the ecology, which in fact lacks voice in the dialogue about corporate behaviour. So I'll answer the first one. So when I said, yeah, there should be a fourth category of motivation, well, it's a bit of a hypothesis, really. So I think it needs to be tested in some way. So I won't absolutely bet the house on it. But what I am indeed arguing that I think psychologists and ecologists and so on are coming to understand that there's something about us being, bodily beings, human animals, that means that we actually are motivated by connection with the ecological world and the world of touch and emotion and so on with our fellow humans and with other animals, and that is different to the other categories of motivation. I think that I probably need to do some more research on that, but I'm thinking of things like Glenn Albrecht's book on earth emotions, which has been cited quite a lot in legal cases now in Australia, and I think this is something that's quite relevant. Of course, environmental concerns can also come into those other categories of motivation, and that's where they've typically been treated before. But I think that any human, including even a CEO of a company, is going to have some residual sense of wanting to be ecologically connected that's different to caring about their reputation or thinking it's the right thing to do as a sort of ethical duty or whatever. And then the question, well, the other question about who's capable of representing, oh yeah, sorry, David.
Maybe Dieter wants to ask first, and then we can go for the text.
Oh, sure.
Dieter, please.
Thank you for the interesting talk and for the inspiration in that area. Just two questions related to kind of related topics in your talk. The first is about pigs. So basically, Braithwaite's responsive regulation was very much about dealing with regulatory capture and finding a response to that and empowering then public interest groups, the pigs, to counterbalance the dominant influence of businesses. So I was wondering where that is positioned in your reinterpretation of regulation theory or responsive regulation and going beyond it with the ecological approach, and also how that fits into the contemporary times when we have not just public interest groups, NGOs that position themselves somehow as representing the minority or suppressed opinions compared to the corporate positions, but where we have actors like Extinction Rebellion that basically argue that more violent action against the system is justified on the basis that the environment is totally sidelined and ignored by profit interests. So something that would link back into your topics, but is currently, or at least in your talk, not reflected. The other part is with your argument about extending regulation to incorporate the interests of nature, of the environment, etc., which is not necessarily that new, but also going back a long way, and has faced a lot of problems in the past. So where basically my question would be, are there particular lessons from, for example, the debates about failures for calling for environmental policy integration, so the various policy models that have been developed to integrate environmental concerns in all decision making, that would pose some limits or lessons at least to be drawn from those experiences? Thank you.
Well, I don't think I can answer all of that, because they're basically the big questions that everybody faces in democratic theory, aren't they? But I'll have a go in a sense. So I think on responsive regulation and public interest groups, or with the unfortunate acronym of PIGS, which really doesn't work when you're doing stuff on animal welfare. It gets very confusing. Yeah, so my argument is that the need for public interest groups or civil society, social movement, social democracy was absolutely fundamental to responsive regulation working, as you pointed out, that otherwise there would be capture. But myself and others, I think Peter Massini might have written about this as well, have pointed out that, you know, mostly when responsive regulation is cited, and it's been cited thousands and thousands of times, that basic precondition of needing that third element is missing from the discussion. So, and that was part of my point, I guess, in saying, and I feel like it's the same with my own work. I know it's been criticised, but usually not having read that, and the same with responsive regulation, it's sort of critiqued for being too market-based without actually I think it's almost like we're so caught in thinking about things in this dyadic way and in this market-based way that we can't even imagine what it would look like to be different. And so it's hard to see how that would work. And your Extinction Rebellion is a good example. There's been a lot of contestation over some of the more extreme actions they've taken. Neil Gunningham has actually did a sort of public lecture series thinking through all of this in quite some detail, and it might be, I think he's a member of Extinction Rebellion and has sort of thought it through, so it might be worth looking at that as well. But what I would say about that is, you know, yes, these things are messy. The big companies do some really terrible things, and some of the social movement groups do some pretty stupid things sometimes as well. Yeah. But that doesn't negate from the fact that, you know, basically we need this social democracy. And I think, you know, you ask about essentially how are the interests of nature to be represented, and there's that other question about corporate reporting, asks the same question. And as you're talking, you know, I thought it's so interesting, isn't it, that like Christopher Stone was one of the people who wrote about corporate self-regulation and regulatory studies, and he also wrote the book about should trees have standing and the rights of nature, and we still haven't quite figured it out. But there's a lot of, so really I'm just calling, I think it's being taken a lot more seriously these days. There's other non-Western countries that are really experimenting with different ways of recognising rights of nature and how to give ecology a voice. And I think we're starting to find those ways. And, you know, we have, there's remarkable stuff happening about how we understand what animals want and how animals talk to each other and talk to us and so on. There's remarkable things starting to happen with recognising Indigenous rights and Indigenous ways of knowledge about how to work with nature and so on. So I think there are hope and possibilities to build that into our regulatory governance systems.
Christine? For the sake of time and keeping in the framework, I would like to ask to give opportunity for two questions, one by Michael and one by Charlotte. We'll take them one after the other, and then you'll have the opportunity to respond. You will need to write, so you don't forget. So Michael first, and then Charlotte, and then we conclude by response by Christine.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks very much. I tried to also start my camera, but that doesn't seem to, I seem to have no control over that at the moment. No. Thank you very much, Christine, if I may say, Christine, for your very inspiring talk. It might be that my question is already answered, but maybe a different kind of phrasing triggers different answers. So I'm going to take a chance at that. First of all, I am very much inspired by the element of the criticism versus the market-based approach. And it's actually, for me, it's mirrored in the work that I do in respect of the energy transition, where basically my conclusion and of some colleagues is that we need a different type of society. It's not only about an energy transition, it's a different type of society. It's about energy democratization. That ties in with the thinking that a transition as a major change in policy brings shifts in governance, like liberalization in the energy sector led to a shift from state to market. And now the emphasis, the transition to sustainability, would lead to a shift to more civil society type of governance, which I believe also affects the way we conceptualize our thinking about justice, such as with respect to the recognition of certain actors. And that actually, I think, fits very well with your emphasis on rights of nature and the recognition of natural phenomena, to put it like that, and actually empowering the primary affected. And I've always seen it as a bit of a frustration, so to speak, that you may regulate protection of nature and create duties, but the relationship, the regulatory relationship with the one being under a duty and the other being able to claim doesn't really exist, other than that government could be a steward. And so it's an appealing thought to me, those rights of nature. But at the same time, of course, it does require, as you were just saying, a voice and communication with the actors that you name, the, let's say, ecological, non-human actors, is a difficult thing there. And would need then representation such as NGOs. And we've seen wonderful examples, and of course in the Netherlands, where I am at the moment, we have the Agenda case and the Shell case, wonderful examples. But still, I'm not sure whether that adds anything to this element of the motivation that you name, the three strands or three types of motivation. So on the one hand, I think the ecological or the rights of nature is a good thing that emphasizes the ecological and the need for a really major change in how we look at environmental or ecological governance. But I still struggle with the need to represent those voiceless interests. So if you could share some more thoughts about this, that would be really welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. And now Charlotte, please.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation, and thank you for enabling me to ask the question, David. Yeah, I guess in a way my point follows on quite nicely from Michael's, insofar as I think that for me, in a lot of my work, I see that the real stumbling block is how we communicate with each other. And so in the area of reporting that C, I think quite rightly brought up, you know, reporting is only takes us so far, doesn't it? And it's how do we respond to those reports? How do we interpret those reports? How then do we, you know, take the next steps after the reports come out? And I think that ultimately it does boil down to how we do all communicate. And I think it's very much it's a multiple way process. And one little example I can possibly give is through our own experiences. And so in the UK, we've been sort of very much interested in decolonising our curriculums. But actually, when it comes down to really doing that properly, we often, I think, have our own misconceptions and misunderstandings, and we do require that education to be a two-way process. And, you know, sometimes we can be almost frozen into not acting because we're too scared, because we don't understand fully. So I just feel that communication is a really important aspect of regulation. So I'm just wondering what you think about that. Thank you.
Well, I think these are marvelous questions, and I think, you know, I've posed the challenge, and I feel like the questions are kind of going along with the challenge. I think what I would say is, I think you're absolutely right, Charlotte. You know, these are matters of communication, and it takes, I guess I have a broadly deliberative democracy sort of bent to the way I think about things. And we know from all that theory, this is not easy. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of commitment. We'll get it wrong, you know, and we'll just have to keep learning. And the same, you know, with the whole question about the rights of nature, but there's also so much happening, so much good commitment by people, so many interesting things starting to happen that we can work on and talk about and encourage and learn from. So I guess I'm really just saying these are really important agendas for us to work on and to incorporate into regulatory studies, not just, you know, leave it to the animal rights lawyers or the environmental rights lawyers or whatever. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you very much for fascinating presentation and the contribution to the regulation and governance group and thinking. It's certainly richer with you, much richer with you, and I hope to host you again here in this seminar in the coming months. Thank you very much all, and we will be in touch. We have another presentation next week with on measuring compliance with Melissa Rory and Benjamin Van Rooij. And we also have plans for the next months, but they are not set yet. The videos of this talk and other talks are on our channel, and I invite you to subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye.